Thank you so much. It's really my pleasure to be here, and I wanted to thank Jerry Serrata for making the connection, and Ermin and everyone else who was involved with making the arrangements for me to be here. It's really a pleasure, and I look forward to. Should this be forward?
Closer, just a little bit closer.
Yeah, so I really look forward to some conversation both in this room and afterwards over lunch. I really look forward to meeting all of you. So what's going on today in Egypt is probably on people's minds, but I wanted to start at the beginning of my own connection to Egypt and tell you a little bit about our experience in Egypt. Some of you know of, or maybe even know my husband, Reuben Firestone, who is like me a rabbi, and he's also an academic in the field of Islam. And I always begin by acknowledging that the idea of moving to Egypt for his sabbatical with 2 of our 3 children was not my idea. It was really his idea, and he wanted to go to improve his Arabic and really for the experience of living in a Muslim Arab country. And it was something he was personally interested in, and also as someone who's so involved with Jewish-Muslim engagement, both in this country and abroad, it was something he felt he needed to do. I was supportive of all that, but my first response was really negative. I didn't want to live in Egypt. We'd gone to visit as a family at the end of 2000, December 2000. We were living in Israel at the time. And I had found, probably more than any place I've ever been in the world, Cairo and Upper Egypt, the land of the pharaohs, was probably the most fascinating place I'd ever been. But Cairo in particular was not a comfortable place. There were security guards and military and police on every corner. And it was not something, while I welcomed the opportunity to visit again, I couldn't see living there. Particularly, I had questions what it would be like for me as a woman long-term to live there for 6 months. Would I be able to go places on my own? I wasn't sure. But I was more concerned really for our boys. Being Jewish and aware that Egypt was not just, that most people in Egypt are strongly anti-Israel, and that kind of carries over often to be anti-Jewish, anti-Semitic. I had fears that we were potentially, in the interest of a positive experience, putting them in harm's way. And I myself am the daughter of Jews originally from Germany who fled Germany before and during World War II, and lost, particularly my father, lost some of his family, and were really traumatized in their life. So for me, to willingly put my boys in a position where they might be harassed, they might have problems as Jews, when it was a choice, why would I do that? On the other hand, I very quickly saw that for my own interests in Jewish-Muslim relations, my own interest in the Middle East, the opportunities for all of us to live in an Arab-Muslim country for a period of time and hopefully make friends and really come to understand perspectives so different from our own. Not just with casual conversations, but really getting to know people and having sustained conversations over time. That was very attractive. So it was the flip side of my fears were, from the beginning, I could see as just really very special opportunities. And the more I thought about it, the more we talked about it, the more interested I was. And the boys, they were 12 and 17 at the time. Our daughter was a little bit older and she was in college. So it was just, we were going with our boys. They were up for the adventure. I should just say that these are boys who had spent their whole life in Jewish day schools and having spent time in Israel, not sheltered. We take adventures, but this was, and they had been in Egypt and they had been in Turkey, but this would be a whole different thing to live there. So we were strongly advised before going to not be open about being Jewish. and while we were living in Egypt. In fact, you may think, oh, that's an overreaction, but both from Jews who'd spent time in Egypt and from Egyptians, that was the advice we were given. In fact, it was virtually a condition of acceptance in school for the boys. They were going to an American international school in Cairo, and when we got the call from the head of school, congratulating us and saying that they were happy to admit the boys, to accept the boys, the head of school was very open about his concern that the boys, even though they prided themselves on being an ecumenical school, that really meant in terms of Muslim-Christian relations, they never had any Jewish students. So the boys would be the first Jewish students. And the advice, well, it's more than advice. The strong advice was that they not be open about being Jewish, and that they, when they had friends maybe halfway into the semester, they could selectively tell their friends they were Jewish, but it should never be public information. And when Israel came up in conversation, they should listen and not argue. And when I heard this, when we got off the phone, I said, we need to find another school. But after some conversation, it became clear this really was the best place for the boys. It was an American international school with an American curriculum, which was important because Noam was an 11th grader and taking AP courses, and he needed to be able to do that. But it was over 80% Egyptian kids, and we wanted that for the kids. We wanted them to be with Egyptians, not with Americans. And so these schools are really largely for, I'd say, the Egyptian elite. That is, these are kids who were getting a wonderful education who would then study in Britain or, I don't know, they had access to higher education opportunities abroad. So we had never had the experience of not being open about being Jewish, and we found it very challenging, more than we anticipated, to always be on guard with how we reacted to things so that we wouldn't be giving away the fact that we were Jewish. We found, I want to say, from the beginning, from the first morning in Cairo, we were almost overwhelmed by the warmth of the Egyptian people. In our neighborhood and in general, we just had very, very positive experiences. At the same time, we often wondered, well, if they knew we were Jewish, would they be reacting the same way? But I think it's so important, I really want to emphasize, as much as you can generalize about people, the character of the Egyptian people, just the general warmth was something that we all were bowled over by. I don't think I ever asked for directions in Egypt, in Cairo, without somebody starting to give me directions and then say, you know what, let's go, and walking there with me. That was true not 90% of the time, 100% of the time. I was always accompanied where I was going, and that's not what happens here in the US, I don't need to tell you. So my main project in Cairo, thank goodness, was learning Arabic. And I started to learn the alphabet actually on the plane. I really knew no Arabic. And I'm so glad that that was what I spent my time doing, because even though it was just 6 months, and there was a limit how much I could learn, but that really was my project. And I learned quite a bit given the limited time. And it opened doors. I was able to get to know people I would never have gotten to know otherwise. And the two most important relationships in that category were really with two women. Zaina, my Arabic teacher, who was 23 years old, university-educated, religious Muslim woman, who was really, she could have been my daughter. We became very, very close, and I'll be referring to her later. And Mahapa, the woman who cleaned in our apartment twice a week. She did not speak a word of English, and she became my unofficial teacher of Arabic. And both of them really also were very helpful in terms of our coming to understand a very different, what is in some ways a very different culture and way of life. So I'd actually like to just read a little bit from the end of chapter 1 where I explain why the title, Crossing Cairo, and then I will read on a little bit the first day I met Mahapa. Every time we went downtown, I was reminded of our experience in Cairo 5 years earlier. Crossing the streets of Cairo, more than the presence of so many gun-bearing policemen, security guards, and soldiers, was what had most unnerved me. In other respects, walking in downtown Cairo was a unique, if intense, experience. Walking around the city in a moving sea of people always made me feel like I was entering a kaleidoscope of different colors, smells, and sounds, with horns honking and people hawking their wares, donkeys and taxis competing for their space on the road, and the swell of pedestrian traffic taking on a life of its own. People spilling off the sidewalks into the streets seemed to almost rub elbows with the taxis and buses zooming by. The few traffic lights that worked were completely ignored. It was amusing, unless one needed to get across the street. How to get across 6 lanes of quickly moving traffic with our 3 children? Our daughter, now in college, had been with us on that trip. At times, I couldn't bring myself to step off the sidewalk, and I would keep walking straight, hoping to find a better place to cross further on, only to discover it was even worse up ahead. Is it really worth risking our lives to cross the street? I would yell to Ruvain. You just have to do it, he would yell back in response. These street crossings brought us as close as we ever came to a divorce. But I later found my fears justified by our guidebooks that described crossing the streets of Cairo as being just as harrowing as I thought it was. Even for a short distance, one of them suggested it was probably better to take a taxi than to walk. When it came to driving, Maadi, where we lived, was a scaled-down version of downtown Cairo. There were no traffic lights or even stop signs in Maadi, while the streets here were also crowded with old, battered, black and white taxis, private cars, buses and minibuses, men on bicycles, and even an occasional donkey. Pedestrians seemed to prefer the streets to sidewalks. The roads were very narrow and met each other at odd angles, given the dominance of traffic circles with 6 to 8 streets radiating from their center. Whether traffic was heavy or light, cars wove in and out of traffic, defying others' efforts to drive straight ahead, sometimes even daring to drive into oncoming traffic, if that turned out to be the direction the driver wanted to go. It was a little bit like the bumper car rides I had enjoyed as a child, only here you were supposed to threaten, but not actually bump. And these bumper cars had horns. Horns, in fact, seemed to provide the only working traffic control system in the city. Drivers honked their horns continually, warning other drivers of their approach at intersections or that they wanted to pass. There was a language of sorts, of single short honks, letting other drivers know they were approaching, and more rapid honks to express irritation or more urgent warning. For the most part, drivers seemed to know how to threaten but avoid actual collisions, though I witnessed several accidents in Maadi. On my trips downtown, especially after Ruvain began his work and the boys started school, crossing Cairo emerged as a metaphor in my mind of the fears and fascination with which I approached Cairo. It pointed to my deep desire to make the most of this opportunity to experience life in Cairo and get to know its people and places. At the same time, the phrase conjured up my fears of simply crossing the street, as well as my questions about how successful I would be in stepping over the barriers that separated me from Egyptian culture as an American, a woman, and a Jew. So before I go into this part about meeting Mahapa, I just want to mention that as many of you may know, I don't know if you know, but in Egypt the pronunciation of Arabic, the soft G, as in jalabiya, becomes a hard G, galabiya. So I use that pronunciation because we were in Egypt and that's where I was learning Arabic, and just we were living in Egypt. Surprisingly, it was easier to find a housekeeper than an Arabic class for me to join. Basama, the owner of our apartment, recommended a woman named Mahapa who had worked for her family for years. She called her for us and told her when to come. When the doorbell rang, I knew it was Mahapa and opened the door. There she stood, completely covered from head to toe in a full hijab and a large navy blue galabiya draping loosely over her body with only her face showing. She was smiling back at me, her dark eyes dancing. "Assalamu alaikum," I greeted her, motioning for her to come in, a little bit nervous but curious about the obviously warm and friendly woman standing before me. "Wa alaikum assalam," she answered, her smile widening. She started to chatter to me in Arabic, and without seeming to pause for a breath, she swept into the kitchen and started removing layers of clothing. With one hand, she pulled her large hijab over her head, and with her other hand, she started to unbutton the top buttons of her galabiya. Then with both hands, she lifted her galabiya up over her head, talking to me all the while. When she was finished, she stood before me barefoot, having left her shoes just outside the apartment door, still modestly dressed in a long-sleeved house dress. She was, even without all the layers, a big woman. I finally managed to get a word in and told her I didn't speak Arabic, but that I was trying to learn. "Mish mushkila, no problem." Mahapa smiled again. She continued to talk to me, a little slower now, looking around the kitchen. "Inti Aiza tishrabi shai, would you like a cup of tea?" I asked her. "No, thank you, madam. I already had tea at home." "I just drink 1 cup a day," she answered, holding up one finger. This much Arabic, with the help of a little sign language I could understand. Mahapa had cleaned our apartment once before we moved in, and she seemed ready to jump in and get started. She motioned to the kitchen closet, asking, I assumed, if the cleaning materials were still there. I nodded and opened the closet door, and she took out the bucket and rags. She started cleaning the kitchen, and I went off to do other things. A few hours later, our apartment was clean, and Mahapa was disappearing again under her layers, pulling her hijab over her head. At Mahapa's suggestion, we had agreed that she would come and clean twice a week. With Ruvain's help, I asked her if we could sit and speak Arabic together for half an hour or an hour each time she came, as part of her work time. She liked the idea. So, I'm going to fast forward a little bit. We arrived in Cairo at the end of January 2006 and stayed till the end of July 2006. And we went back twice, and I'll once before, once after the revolution, and I'll be talking about that later. But it was for the holiday of Passover, we went to Israel for the beginning of the holiday to be with friends and have a Seder, and we made that arrangement before we got to Egypt. We didn't know how comfortable we would be in the end in Egypt, what the experience would be like, and we wanted to be sure to have a nice Passover, particularly for the boys. But we were just in Israel for the beginning of the holiday, and then we came back to Cairo for the rest of the holiday. And it was really at that point that we started telling some more of our friends that we were Jewish. The person I was most concerned about telling we were Jewish was Mahapa. I did not want to do anything that might damage a relationship that felt so precious. Mahapa came to work, but let me just say that she really spoke no English, and it was an incredible incentive for me to learn Arabic. And we had it's amazing to me in retrospect how much we were able to communicate. And I, of course, was so interested in learning about her past and about her family, and she had 3 children. Her daughter was in her early 20s and engaged to be married, and a teacher, and it was such a great incentive for me to learn Arabic. And we really, these kind of relationships feel very special. And I felt very close to her. And I did not want to do anything that might damage this relationship. Mahapa came to work 2 days after we returned from our trip. And when we were in the kitchen, she asked me where we had traveled. Had we gone down to Upper Egypt to see the pharaonic temples? No, I answered, suddenly realizing I did not want to lie. Taking a breath, I turned to her and answered, we went to Israel. Mahapa gave an involuntary start and took a small step back. Israel, she said with an emotion somewhere between distrust and distaste. Why would you want to go to Israel? We're Jewish. There, I said it. No going back now. I explained to Mahapa that we'd gone to Israel to celebrate the Jewish holiday of Passover. To my surprise, Mahapa did not blink an eye at the news that we were Jewish. She said something about Jews not eating bread on Passover. How did she know, I wondered, and asked if she'd ever worked for a Jewish family before. No, but she knew about Judaism, she assured me with a confident smile, from television and movies. I realized that Mahapa had probably seen the popular television series based on the protocols of the Elders of Zion, one of the most famous and flagrantly anti-Semitic tracts in history, which had aired the year before during Ramadan in Egypt. This wasn't necessarily good news. I showed Mahapa the boxes of matzah and some other foods special for Passover that we had brought back with us from Israel. She was particularly interested in the matzah and asked how it was made. I tried not to think about the blood libel stories that she might have heard. When Mahapa walked into our house the next day, she was carrying 2 large bags stuffed full with large sheets of a crispy, thin bread. Egyptian matzah, she said proudly. I made it for you. She explained that this was a popular bread in the Arab world called rukak, or ro'ah, in Egypt. Though it was eaten year-round, it was considered a special food to eat when Muslims celebrated the Hajj, the annual pilgrimage to Mecca, Mahapa said. The end of the Hajj was marked by the major holiday Eid al-Adha, the festival of sacrifice. On this holiday, Egyptians eat ro'ah with a special meat dish commemorating the near sacrifice of Abraham's son Ishmael. In the Quran, the son who's almost sacrificed is not named, but later Muslim tradition identifies him as Ishmael, Hagar's son, while in the Torah it is Isaac, Sarah's son. Because it was flat, unleavened bread, Mahapa thought it could also serve as matzah. She clearly liked the idea that the same flat bread could play a role for us both in our respective religious traditions. I was really touched. Instead of seeing it as a barrier, Mahapa had absorbed the fact that we were Jewish and turned it into an opportunity to share something of her tradition in a way that she hoped would add to our celebration of the Jewish holiday. After all my worries, I was deeply relieved to see that my special friendship with Mahapa was not only intact, but that it could expand its boundaries to include this kind of sharing. So the boys also had very rich experiences, particularly Noam, who was in 11th grade, and he really, he frequently came home. Actually, both boys came home. We had really, on a daily basis, debriefing sessions, if you will, often over dinner. Sometimes it couldn't wait, and it would happen as soon as the boys came in. Like the day Noam came home and asked, I have a question. Didn't we win the Yom Kippur War? Referring to the October War between Egypt and Israel, which Israelis and Westerners generally view as a victory for Israel, and Egyptians universally view as a victory for Egypt. But he hadn't known that, and his friend Muhammad in school, it seemed every 3 men in Cairo was Muhammad. So we had stationery store Muhammad, internet cafe Muhammad, across the street Muhammad. Anyway, Noam, one of his best friends at school was a young man a year older than him, senior and president of the student body, and he was one of the circle of student leaders with whom the head of school had consulted about whether it was a good idea for the boys to come to the school. And it was that leadership group which had said, yes, but they shouldn't tell anyone they're Jewish, etc. So Muhammad had let Noam know from the beginning that he knew that he was Jewish and it was fine with him, and Noam could be open with him, and they had wonderful discussions from the beginning. And Muhammad had shared with him this this particular day, that Egyptians viewed the war between Israel and Egypt in 1973, 72, 73, the 73 war, as a victory for Egypt. So that opened up a whole wonderful conversation with the boys about, how could that be? Same war, two completely different views. And we talked about it a little bit, and there's a museum in Cairo, the Panorama October War Museum, which we've been waiting to go to, and we went to. And it was a fascinating experience, and we had really wonderful discussions about the power of, we've been talking about it before, but this was a very concrete case of two different narratives and what it means to have a different narrative. And in this case, frankly, a narrative, what's the difference, what's the role of propaganda, and the museum presents the war as the first 24 hours of the war, and only that. That is the Egyptian surprise attack on Israeli forces in the Sinai, in which there were very serious casualties, and that's the end of the story, according to this version. So that was a little bit disturbing, more than a little bit disturbing, and it was disappointing, frankly. We welcomed the chance to wrestle with a different narrative, but this was this was one we found really problematic. But again, it was a great learning experience, and it also got us to question what's the benefit, the positive benefit of encountering different narratives in a positive way. It gets you to question your own assumptions and the way one is reading history and current events, and that was very positive. That is, we got to see that while in terms of where the war went, I think Israel won that war. On the other hand, there was a very significant victory for Egypt in having had that surprise attack that was successful, and really destroying at the time, and that remained, the sense, the image of invincibility that Israel had put forth was broken, was really broken by that war and never rebuilt on Israel's part. And anyway, that's a more complicated, it's something we can discuss if you want. But there were other things. I'll just mention one. The whole, I would say, our increasing understanding of the role of honor in the Arab world was also a very important learning piece. The Danish cartoons incident happened just months before we went to Egypt. And the way that was understood by us, and I think most Westerners, was free speech, the value of free speech, the importance of freedom of the press. How could that be challenged? Why was it wrong to have critique or a political cartoon? What was the problem with that? Why wasn't it okay to challenge, to have a critical view of Islam? But what we came to understand from all sorts of incidents, the young man across the street at the residential hotel where we had first stayed, Muhammad, a young man in his early 20s with whom no one became really good friends. They had amazing conversations. Anyway, no one came in one day really upset that Muhammad had quit his job because his boss had insulted his mother. And we thought, with the economy being what it is in Egypt, you are hurting yourself a lot more than your boss if you quit. How can you, it made no sense to me. But that was just one of a number of incidents over time that really helped me and helped us understand the importance of honor and how that operates in the Arab world, and so that honor killings, how that can make sense. So it radically changed my view, our view of things like the Danish cartoons incident. So that was what we had been hoping for. That was a very positive part of our living in Cairo. I want to just read a little bit Zaina, my Arabic teacher, in addition, as I was learning more Arabic, we were also having really wonderful discussions about Judaism and Islam, about Israel and Palestine. So I'm going to just read a little bit. Let's see, I'm reading out of context here. I had a conversation with another Muslim woman, somebody who identified herself as a liberal Muslim, about why she didn't wear hijab. But most of the women in Cairo today do cover their hair. A huge percentage. I wondered about how Zaina felt about wearing the hijab and asked her in class, and she said she'd be happy to discuss it after class and joined me for a coffee at a cafe. I wear the hijab, she explained, so people will focus on who I am inside, what kind of a person I am, not how I look, she explained. So many people are focused on what does she look like, does she have a nice body? That is not how I want people to relate to me. Islam teaches that men should have respect for women, and the hijab is part of that. Excuse me. I know that there are people who say just the opposite, she continued. They say that Islam gives women a lower role, but that is not Islam. It is the wider culture we are part of. Islam teaches respect for women and rights for women. Another reason I wear the hijab, excuse me, and for me the really important reason, is that the hijab is something like prayer. When I put on the hijab, it reminds me of my connection to Allah. It reminds me how I want to act, how I want to be in the world. I found this a beautiful idea. Zaina and I agreed that the greatest spiritual challenge is not how we behave during times of prayer, but in the course of daily life when interacting with other people. I mentioned that for Jews, wearing a kippah, Hebrew for yarmulke or skull cap, had perhaps the same purpose, to remind people, traditionally men, of being in the presence of God. I shared with Zaina how much I liked hearing the slow and soothing chants of Quran recitation that wafted through the market from CD players in the small shops up and down Road 9 as I did my errands. I welcomed the chanting as a reminder to slow down and take a breath, to be patient, and treat people around me with kindness, instead of just pushing ahead to get my errands done as quickly as possible. Zaina nodded. But if this indeed was the purpose of hijab, I wondered out loud, why was it only for women? Was there anything equivalent for men? Zaina did not know. While I certainly could appreciate this added benefit of wearing the hijab, it did not change the problematic aspect of requiring women to cover their hair as an expression of modesty in my eyes. I thought of married Orthodox Jewish women who also covered their hair with wigs, scarves, or hats, often for the same reason, and my objections to what I had always regarded as overly stringent rules of modesty for women. Now that I'd been living in Cairo for over 4 months, I was beginning to notice my own attitudes and thinking on certain subjects changing. One striking example was with regard to this issue of modesty. While I was still opposed to women having to cover their hair on other issues of dress, I was becoming more conscious of modesty. Increasingly, I found it disturbing to see women who were obviously foreigners wearing short sleeves and on occasion even sleeveless tops. Didn't they know that's not how people here dressed? One day, I caught myself thinking how much more attractive women actually looked in long pants and long sleeves. I shook my head in surprise, but that was genuinely how I felt. One day in early June, I met Ruvain downtown near AUC, the American University of Cairo, and we decided to grab a bite before heading to the market to buy some gifts. We went into a fast food restaurant near the university and ordered Alexandria's, cooked beans served in pita bread with chopped tomatoes, peppers, and onions, a little bit like a good chili. I noticed 3 American men, probably in their 20s, standing around a small raised table in the middle of the restaurant eating. They were wearing shorts and sleeveless tank tops, their biceps bulging. They stood with their feet set wide apart, chomping on their sandwiches, talking loudly to each other. They seemed totally oblivious that their dress and even body language was grossly out of place here. The young men exuded an arrogance that was embarrassing to me as a fellow American. I watched as one of them took a big bite out of his sandwich and swallowed it down with a gulp of Coke. Where did they think they were? I was indignant. But lest it sound like I was about to don the full burqa myself, I also had moments that pushed me completely in the other direction. As the weather was growing hotter by the day, I was increasingly amazed to see women running around the outdoor track at the Nadi, the health club, still totally covered in traditional garb. Often this meant not just one, but several layers of clothing. Long pants and a long-sleeve tunic blouse, followed perhaps by a skirt and vest before the final layer of galabiya and hijab. How could women run, wrapped in all these clothes, I wondered, and not suffer a heat stroke? One morning that was hotter than most, I pushed myself to go for a run at the Nadi. As I was warming up for exercise, I was surprised to see a woman rounding the track completely covered in a burqa, with only the tiniest of slits for her eyes. She was even wearing long-sleeved black gloves, so no skin would show. I was sweating in my shorts and t-shirt. I couldn't begin to imagine how this woman must experience the penetrating heat of the sun beating down on us, fully cloaked in black and running. I had recently noticed that most of the women wearing the burqa were young, in their 20s. I wondered once again what thinking motivated this choice in attire that seemed to deny any individuality in presentation of self. Not even the woman's face was allowed to show. In this heat, physical discomfort seemed an unfair accompaniment of modesty. Men, even in uniform, were now walking the streets in short sleeves, or at least light-colored and lightweight cottons. I knew women had all kinds of reasons for wearing hijab and assumed the same was true with regard to the fuller black garb. But try as I might, I could not help but see the burqa as an oppressive custom, pressuring women to cover up as if their physical bodies and their sexuality was something to be ashamed of. I resented that it turned every woman into an almost formless black mountain, gliding anonymously through the streets. It made me want to wear short sleeves in protest. So that's my very honest, emotional reaction. I'm going to read just one other short passage about a conversation of a more political nature, and it's one of many conversations that really helped me understand what I found so challenging about these kinds of conversations. This was a woman I met. We learned about an interfaith dialogue group that was beginning to meet in Cairo, and we were invited to go to one of their meetings, and then we followed up on several occasions with several of the people in that group, and it was really a wonderful opportunity for us. So one of the women, Sophia, was probably the person I met who was most like me. That is, she and her husband lived in Mahdi. Their children went to the same school as our children. We were about the same age. She was a little bit younger. She was university educated and an architect. And her husband worked for USAID in a water projects kind of work. And we had met for coffee. We sat and talked for something like 3 hours, really about our families and our children. They had lost a child, and that had been a really traumatic thing through a genetic disease. And we were, two women sharing our personal stories and really connecting with each other. And just before she dropped me off at home, she said something about how America was at war with the Muslim world. And we had talked about that a little bit. Later that night, I was still trying to wrap my mind around Sophia's view that American foreign policy in the Middle East expressed the deeper reality of America being at war with the Muslim world. We were at war with Islamist extremism, but not the whole Muslim world. Where I saw different actions and policies on the part of the United States, Sophia saw a general trend. I found it stunning and very difficult to connect this view with my own sense of American policy evolving in distinctive ways in response to the different circumstances of each country in the Middle East. Sadly, I guess that Sophia's view was probably not so uncommon in the Arab Muslim world. Even if it was untrue as I believed it was, this view probably served as a lens for many Arab Muslims looking at American behavior at home and in the Middle East. When Sophia heard about particular instances of prejudice and hostility against Muslims in the United States, this would reinforce the image she held of my country, while for me, they stood as exceptions to what I see as the true America. I felt like I had hit upon something about the power of the narrative we each carry around. New evidence was always interpreted in the light cast by that narrative. If it resonated with the narrative, it reinforced it. If it conflicted, we tended to see the new information as an exception, or even of questionable veracity. In this way, without even being aware of it, we tended to dismiss contrary evidence that could pose a challenge and at times a corrective to our narrative. And in times of greater polarization and fear of the other, this tendency would be even stronger. Thinking about the challenges I found myself experiencing in these conversations was helping me understand why it was sometimes so difficult for people on different sides to really hear each other. I didn't share really much of anything about discussions about Israel, which were really the most challenging part of our time in Cairo. And that's something I can talk a little bit more about. Our last 10 days in Egypt, as it turned out, were the first 10 days of the war in 2006 between Hezbollah and Israel. So that turned out to be a very fascinating and very challenging time. I will say that even though I initially had not been I hadn't been thrilled at the thought of going to Egypt. I would have preferred to live in an Arab community of Israel. When it was time to leave Egypt, I really didn't want to go. I was ready to sign up for 2 more years. I really wanted to stay and get to know people better and really get to know the language and get inside the culture more than we'd been able to even. And I'm very glad that we've been able to maintain a relationship. We went back to Cairo a year later. Ruvain gave a wonderful lecture at Ain Shams University, a public lecture. I'll just give you a headline there. That is, he spoke about the origins of the chosen people idea in Judaism, Christianity, and Islam. And it was the best talk I've ever heard him give. And there was a 2-hour Q&A, if you can believe that, which sounds like it was potentially a wonderful thing. Unfortunately, the colleague and dear friend who had invited him to speak, Mohammed Hawari, who was and is and remains a wonderful friend of ours, he's an Egyptian Muslim whose field of scholarship is Judaism, just like Ruvain is a Jew whose field of scholarship is Islam. And in his pride, he said something about Ruvain being not only an American scholar, but a Jew and a rabbi. And that turned out to be a kiss of death. That is, the questions were incredibly hostile. And 3 days later, front page headlines in the main newspapers of Egypt were Jewish rabbi attacks Islam, which had not been what Ruvain was doing. It was a big deal. And if Ruvain's photo had been in the paper, we would have left. But there was no photo, so that was good. But it was quite a learning experience. That was not all negative, but it was discussed in Parliament. It was really it was kind of an amazing thing that happened. But we also went back after the revolution, July 2011, and reconnected with people and it was really wonderful to, for me to spend time with Zaina. And my teacher, she had gotten involved in the Socialist Party. She was very involved in the revolution, post-revolution. Why the Socialist Party? Because she wanted to get involved in the best group she could find that was fighting religious sectarian discrimination. And I can't help but think, I never asked her, I really should, if her getting to know a Jew and Jewish family, rabbis, if that was part of it. But she was at the time spending all her time after work in Tahrir Square. There were protests and demonstrations going on again in July 2011. So she introduced us to the people in the Socialist Party tent, and we spent 3 different afternoons we were there with her. And it was really fascinating to hear from her, from Mahapa, from our various friends, what things looked like from their perspective, and just to be in Cairo. And to see people openly in public, this was the best, openly in public debating political points of view, where when we had been there in 2006, nothing like that. In fact, I'll just give you an example. Muhammad, the Internet Cafe Muhammad, was incredibly helpful to us and warm and lovely with the boys whenever we went in there. And he wondered if we were, I think he wondered if maybe we were Israeli or American Palestinian, or because Ravaine's Arabic was really good. It wasn't Egyptian, but it was good. And anyway, we deflected those questions. But we saw him one day on the metro, and he pretended he did not know us. He acted like he didn't know us, and I couldn't understand it. I was really hurt. First I thought he didn't want to be bothered. It was Friday, on his day off. But then it became clear to me he was acting like he didn't know us. And we got off the train at the same stop, and he walked ahead of us, again, went through the turnstile ahead of us like he didn't know us. And it was only later, in reflecting on it, it was actually when I was writing, that it clicked for me that he thought maybe we were Israeli. He didn't want to be seen talking to us by the wrong people. And when Ravaine gave that lecture and we met with graduate students who were getting degrees in Jewish studies, there's a wonderful Israeli academic center in Cairo. And even though they wanted to go there, they did not feel comfortable going or even calling, because who might see them and think the wrong thing, and it was just too precarious. So a few years later, post-revolution, to see people openly debating politics on the street, this is a different world. So obviously, just like in 2011, day to day, there were surprises and turns of events that were really unpredictable. So too, that's been happening in a different direction. More recently, the counter-revolution, call it what you will. These are really very difficult times in Egypt, and it's, for us, heartbreaking. Again, I'm very glad to have sustained relationships and to be connected with people who, including a man who was we refer to him as our political analyst on the ground, a 21-year-old who was politically very sophisticated, very thoughtful, very nuanced in his thinking. And we're still in touch with him. He's actually right now, he got his doctorate, and he's teaching in Berlin at a university, and back and forth to Cairo. So it's been, I just spoke with him last week, actually. So anyway, I look forward to your questions and appreciate, you've been a wonderful, very attentive audience, and look forward to some conversation.